Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's session of the Conversations on South Asia series. The Conversation series is hosted by faculty in the South Asian Studies Collective here at Dartmouth College, each of whom select books published during the past 2 years for us to discuss and reflect on publicly in a webinar. My name is Kirk Gambetta. I am the faculty coordinator for this year's Conversation series, as well as a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows and a lecturer in the Department of Art History here at Dartmouth. So we in the South Asian Studies Collective are very excited today to be hosting a conversation about Martin Saxer's new book, Places and Knots, Remoteness and Connectivity in the Himalayas and Beyond, published in 2023 by Cornell University Press. Following introductions by Dartmouth professor Sienna Craig, Martin Saxer will begin by presenting his book, after which Alice Millington and Jeff Childs will provide their responses. But before proceeding with today's book conversation, I want to make a few announcements and acknowledgments about the series. First, I want to make everyone aware of the final session in our conversation series this winter quarter. On February 27th and at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be discussing Sri Rupa Roy's new book, The Political Outsider, Curative Democracy and the Lineages of Populism. In addition, do look for sign-up information in our email correspondence, our website, and social media accounts for events in the spring quarter. We will have two more, one about Nesargi Dave's book and Akriti Mandvani's book as well in both April and May. So do look forward to those events and look for more information about them shortly. Secondly, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this event, the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages, and the Bodas Funds for South Asian Programming at Dartmouth. Thank you as well to our two Bodas Fellows, Navya Bharadwaj and Mritula Sarvanan, for helping organize today's conversation. Lastly, thank you to Hope Rennie in the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages for all of her help with this series, without which it would really not be possible. One overall reminder to attendees, please leave your comments in the Q&A box, not the chat. And you're welcome to start leaving comments in the Q&A box at any point during the session. I would like to now introduce Sienna R. Craig, our moderator for today's conversation. Professor Craig holds the Jane and Raphael Bernstein Professorship in Asian Studies in the Department of Anthropology at Dartmouth College here in Hanover. She is a medical and cultural anthropologist whose relationships with Himalayan and Tibetan communities spans 3 decades and bridges communities in Asia and North America. Craig is the author of The Ends of Kinship, Connecting Himalayan Lives Between Nepal and New York, published by the University of Washington Press in 2020, Mustang in Black and White with the photographer Kevin Bobrisky, published by Vajra Publications in 2018, Healing Elements, Efficacy, and the Social Ecologies of Tibetan Medicine, published by the University of California Press in 2012, and Horses Like Lightning, A Story of Passage Through the Himalayas, published by Wisdom Publications in 2008. And this is among other publications. She enjoys writing across creative and scholarly genres and is currently at work on a collaborative project with Jeff Childs, who's also with us today, and Nepal-based research colleagues on aging, place, and care in the age of migration. So with that, I'll now ask Sienna to introduce today's speakers and respondents.
Thank you so much, Kurt. It's really wonderful to be here and to be part of this conversation. It's very much my privilege and my pleasure to introduce Dr. Martin Saxer, whose work we're going to be talking about and focused on today. Martin is an anthropologist based at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. He is a Heisenberg Fellow, and he leads a research project currently called Foraging at the Edge of Capitalism, which is funded by an ERC Consolidator grant. He's the author of several publications that are really wonderful, including the book we're talking about today, but also including Manufacturing Tibetan Medicine, The Creation of an Industry and the Moral Economy of Tibetanness, which was published by Berghahn Publications in 2013, as well as Places and Knots, which we'll be talking about today. Martin is also an artist, a photographer, and a filmmaker. And his latest film, Merkab, had its international premiere at the Locarno Film Festival, and it won first prize for the best documentary at the Dumbo Film Festival in New York. So welcome, Martin. So nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Our two commentators today are Alice Millington and Jeff Childs. Alice is an ethnographer who is currently a postdoctoral fellow in social anthropology at St. John's College at the University of Oxford. She has an interdisciplinary background, both in geography and in social anthropology, and she holds degrees from the University of Cambridge, as well as SOAS, the University of London. Her doctoral fieldwork took place in the village of Walung in eastern Nepal, which is directly connected to Martin's book and work. And her PhD thesis won the Britain-Nepal Academic Council's Dissertation Prize last year in 2024. Broadly, Alice's research considers how the rapidly changing Himalayan climate is affecting human temporal perception. She's also very interested in narratives of Buddhist prophetic decline, ideas about life expectancy, and changing border livelihoods in eastern Nepal. And last but not least, my dear friend and colleague Jeff Childs is a professor of anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. He's an anthropological demographer and cultural anthropologist who studies the interplay of culture with fertility, family formations, migration, and aging in both historical and contemporary contexts. He is the co-author with Namgyal Churup of a book called From a Trickle to a Torrent, Education, Migration, and Social Change in a Himalayan Valley of Nepal, which came out in 2019 with the University of California Press. And he's also the author of an incredible book, which I love to teach with, called Himalayan Diary, which traces in many ways change and continuity in Nupuri, Nepal, where he's been working also for more than 30 years. And as Kurt said in his introduction of me, Jeff and I are embarked right now on a collaborative research project on aging, place, and care in two different parts of Nepal and also New York City. So with those introductions, I'd like to turn the floor over to Martin to speak a bit about his book.
Thank you. It's an honor and a joy to be here. And I was given like 10 to 12 minutes to give a summary of the book, which I will try to do. I will half read so that it's a bit more concise. Now, this book, first and foremost, it tells a story about two seemingly remote places in the Himalayas and their connections to the wider world. Upper Humla, including the Limi Valley in the far northwest corner of Nepal, and the village of Walung in northeast of Nepal. In both places, a dialect of Tibetan is spoken, and both places traditionally had official relations with both Tibet and the Kingdom of Nepal. More generally, this book is also an attempt to think about remoteness and connectivity. The idea of remoteness is omnipresent in conjunction with Himalayan valleys and villages, be it in development discourse or in the tourism industry, or in the idea of the hidden valleys as spiritual sanctuaries. When I say remoteness and connectivity, however, I don't use these words as analytical terms. I rather see them as powerful ideas or concepts so widely used that they actually require analysis. The beginnings of this project date back to 2007 and 2008 when I was doing research for my PhD thesis on a different topic. At that time, I was looking into the industrialization of Tibetan medicine on the Tibetan plateau. Within a very short period of time, an entire industry had emerged, producing Tibetan pharmaceuticals based on plants mostly collected in the wild. And as many of the medicinal plants used were not endemic, most of them had to be imported from other places, mainly from Nepal and the southern flanks of the Himalayas. Traveling with an herb trader to Nepal to buy herbs for the factories in Tibet in 2008, I realized that something strange was happening. More and more traders started shipping their herbs not via the main road, the main artery of trade between Kathmandu and Lhasa, at that time the Friendship Highway, but rather started using more remote border crossings that I had thought had long been closed or abandoned or not used anymore. I started getting interested in all trade routes between Tibet and Nepal. In the late 2000s, everybody was talking about the rise of China, and I wondered what this rise meant for the people living directly along its borders. So, after my PhD, I started a new project entitled Neighboring China to look into this question. When I began this project in 2011, many things were happening in northern Nepal at the same time. It was just about the peak of the trade in caterpillar fungus in Yartsagumbu, this little mushroom hybrid worth more than gold that drove so many riches in the Himalayas, also in Tibet. Meanwhile, the world financial crisis and then the European sovereign debt crisis had brought quite a lull to the tourism industry of Nepal, and many people were looking for other sources of income. And last but not least, across the border in Tibet, the People's Republic descended on a road building frenzy. They were building one road after the other on the Tibetan plateau. So by 2012 or 2013, most regions in northern Nepal still had no connection to the Nepali road network. But just across the border in Tibet, there was a brand new road hedge waiting to be used. All of these factors together meant that many of these old shops in Kathmandu went back to become traders along these dusty trails leading to Tibet. While just a few years later, a series of crises at the borders shattered many of the high hopes of the early 2010s, the boom I witnessed left me with questions that led to this book. How come that seemingly remote areas in the high valleys of Nepal suddenly felt so cosmopolitan and so naturally connected to the wider world? What is it with this remoteness and connectivity? New funding and a new project entitled Remoteness and Connectivity, Highland, Asia, and the World allowed me to follow up on these questions and write this book. The book proposes three ideas which helped me think through my experiences and observations, and I will briefly sketch them out for you now. The first idea concerns locality, community, and movement. Like everywhere in the Himalayas, outmigration was a big topic in both of these field sites. But unlike the typical labor migration you see in other parts of Nepal, young, mostly men going to the Gulf states or to Malaysia to work for a few years to make money, sending remittances home, and finally coming back and settle. The kind of migration that I witnessed in Upper Humla and in Wallung was much more akin to people embarking on grand odysseys led by the idea to somehow make it somewhere in the world, mostly as a business person, even if they would sometimes work ordinary jobs along the way. And most of them had little or no intention to ever come back. But this did not mean that community or the community of origin was not important to them. I saw how much work was invested to keep the communities of origin together. In other words, what I saw were close communities that were clearly not local, quite in contrast to the imaginaries of the local community conjured up in development and tourism industries. I also saw that people wouldn't venture out randomly, but rather go to a handful of select places, not 10 or 20, but 3, 4, or 5. Historically, this used to be a city in Tibet, maybe Shigatse, and then a village in the Himalayas, and then maybe a town in the Terai, or maybe Kathmandu, or maybe Kolkata. And now it was a village, and a village in a valley in Nepal, and a neighborhood in Darjeeling or Kathmandu, and maybe a neighborhood in New York City. I started seeing these places like tied in a knot and moving out, not just as leaving the community, but also as an extension of community, not as the beginning of disintegration, but as something else. The second idea concerns the spatial texture of Himalayan borderlands. Having read much of the borderland literature, I started out my research with the idea that borderlands were some kind of gray contact zones between two sides of the border. In the Himalayas, however, more important than proximity to a border is the topography involved. While the steep valleys and high passes may not influence culture in the way that older geodeterministic theories had it, the valleys and passes clearly define where people walk, where the trade routes are, and where now roads are being built. Places along these arteries of trade and exchange, which are called pathways, often have a distinctly cosmopolitan vibe and history. In this second part of the book, I follow the construction of One Mountain Road, a private community-based initiative rather than a state-led project. It eventually did not bring the benefits everybody had hoped for, but it left a legacy, shaped local politics, and led to the rapid completion of another road nearby. The third part of the book looks into outside interventions in the name of development. Nepal is home to a plethora of NGOs, most of them small local organizations established to serve as a counterpart for international development agencies and larger NGOs. I was a fellow at ICIMOD, the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, for half a year, and many of my friends had ties to the development industry. Coming to Nepal, I was certainly critical about the development industry, but I also developed a deep respect for the work and dedication of those working for them. The NGOs of today, I would say, are no longer the imperial, neo-colonial, top-down organizations following modernist agendas of development and progress. Rather, they put a lot of effort into community-based participatory approaches and structures. But nevertheless, I saw how little of that world of booming trade and border savvy and ambition I was witnessing had entered the development discourse in Kathmandu. The local community, the problem of outmigration, climate change, agriculture, and sustainable tourism, these were the topics on the agenda, but not local border trade or the transnational ambitions of those involved. To understand this split, I suggest the term curation at large, taking curation not what as the act or the task of a museum curator, but rather in its original meaning of to heal or to cure. This perspective allows me to keep in view both the ambition to cure and the partial erasures that go along with the identification of the ills that need curing. So much for now. I am curious to learn what you think about it and your opinions and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, for that framing of your work. And I'm going to turn it over to Alice first and then Jeff to offer some comments.
Okay, thanks so much. I'd love to start by thanking everyone at Dartmouth who's been involved in the organisation of the event, and thank you also to Martin, firstly for writing a book that I very much enjoyed, and secondly for being involved in the invitation for me to be here to respond to it. So to contextualise my response, as Sienna mentioned during the introduction, I did my doctoral fieldwork in one of Martin's two main Himalayan field sites, which is the village of Warlong in eastern Nepal. Coincidentally, I also completed a stint as a visiting PhD scholar at ISIMOD, which is the organisation that appears in the third section of the monograph. So based on my own experiences and connections to some of the places and knots that Martin describes, my response to his book inevitably feels very personal. But I hope also to draw out some of his many relevant points that engage with academic debate beyond these two sites. There's so much to comment on and praise about places and knots, but in the brief time available, I'll therefore predominantly focus on the sections of the book that deals with places and networks that I've myself experienced as a researcher, so somewhat excluding the Humla parts. So to jump straight into it, when I first read Places in Knots, I think a little time before it was published in 2022, it completely transformed my outlook on Warlong. And part of the reason for this is that Martin's work in documenting the lenses of remoteness and connectivity applied to the Himalayas startlingly confronted my own incipient biases, which had persisted shamefully even after I'd spent 3 months living in the village that's one of his principal field sites. Warlong was, of course, a remote village if we view it in terms of accessibility from the Nepali capital, but it was the word that Martin applies to Warlong, cosmopolitan, that transformed my outlook the most. It would initially seem incongruous to apply it to people living in a village without roads, far from a city and minus the internet. But it's hard to describe. I had seen it in people's demeanor in a way that I couldn't quite put it into words until I read it on the page. Despite the lack of communications, people were tuned in, savvy, completely indifferent to my presence, even though Highland does receive very limited tourism. In fact, the image was miles apart from the rural Himalayan peasantry that proliferated in lots of NGO discourse that I'd encountered. And this becomes all the clearer when we jump into the opening ethnographic vignettes of Places and Knots, the bustling life worlds of the Highland diaspora in Jackson Heights. The same people, the same drive and ambition that I'd come to know during my time in the village was transposed onto a wildly different setting. And yet, Highlanders were instantly recognizable in Martin's prose, which I've always found incredibly evocative. One of the really skillful things that's done in this section is that Martin gestures to the symbols of Highlanders' prosperity. For instance, a boutique on 888 Broadway, which appears in Vogue, without downplaying the struggle and hard work it took to achieve them. And this is a really good picture of how the prestige of the Highland diaspora in Nepal was achieved, partly through hard toil, partly existing only in image, but always very unequally. And in many ways, this part of the book reads as an excellent companion to Professor Craig's ethnography, The Ends of Kinship. By reading them together, you understand a lot more about the dynamics of Himalayan migration than the sum of their parts. From a slightly opposite angle, one thing that the book does comment less on, at least in the Highland case study, is the experiences of those who have been left behind in the villages. Martin emphasizes that Himalayan economies and livelihoods are predicated on mobility, where knowledge of the outside world is a prized and sometimes fungible currency. And this has fostered enormous inequality between those who remain bound to the village and those who are free to move. I was researching climate change, and when I would ask to speak to older residents who could recall the past weather in the region, I would be told she, for it was often a she, won't know anything. She's never set even 1 foot outside this valley. This selective disadvantage of remaining fixed in place has become even more acute since the border regime was tightened during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the context in which I conducted my fieldwork, which is worth briefly reflecting on now. I bring up the post-COVID context to emphasize that whilst the analogy of Places and Knots is undoubtedly essential to understanding the resilience and endurance of Himalayan livelihoods, one thing that isn't quite touched upon is the vulnerability of being enmeshed in a place knot. As history has marched on, as Martin describes, the physical commodities that are being moved by Highlanders across the high passes have changed. But as the place knot analogy helps us realize, it's the Sino-Nepal border that's the principal economic resource available in this region. Like many Himalayan settlements situated on the international boundary between China and Nepal, Highland might never have been settled were it not for its location at the intersection of these complementary economic zones of Tibet and lowland Nepal. It is the border that's Highland's main means of production, its mode of generating surplus value through which profits are derived. And in the days before the border was formalized, predating the 20th century annexation of Tibet, it was intimate knowledge and experience of the challenging Himalayan geography that allowed Highlanders to function as the key holders of connectivity across the brutal high altitude passes that lead to the Tibetan plateau. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic undermined Highland's main reason for existence, which is this practice of transboundary mobility. Instead, my time in Highland suggests that its long-standing knot to Tibetan main trade marts is in danger of becoming a noose. This spectre was briefly raised in the Humla section, as Martin quotes the interviewees saying that without labour in Parang, we'll die. For a long time, the connection that binds these Himalayan villages to the parts of the People's Republic of China has constantly been at risk of severance due to changing geopolitics. And it raises the question, can the knot of places survive if they are separated from arguably their most crucial link? But in this, none of us predicted COVID, and we're reminded that the position of the theorist is not to be a clairvoyant. For timing reasons, I'm going to skip ahead to discussing the third section of the book titled Interventions, which predominantly deals with Martin's tenure as a visiting researcher at the International Centre for Integrated Mountain Development, known as ISMOD. And I actually think that this section of the monograph may be, perhaps it's, well, at least in my perspective, one of the most valuable contributions the book makes, which is not at all to talk down the value of its Himalayan ethnography. But what feels very unique about this section is that it draws attentions to presences in the Himalayas which other ethnographers usually ignore, perhaps to selectively emphasize their site's remoteness and therefore authenticity that's often treated as a fading commodity in Nepal. For sure, it's not usually in an anthropologist's interest to highlight how some communities may deliberately allow themselves to be stage managed by an outside organisation, much less so to suggest that one of the largest supposed pitfalls of development interventions, willful dependency, might be actively curated by some, which Martin suggests for the Humla context. But the section placed where it is structurally in the book becomes a really clear and logical proof of concept of Martin's earlier arguments about the flexibility, opportunism, and resilience that are inherent to Himalayan life worlds. In his commentary about ISOMOD, which I really would highly recommend to anyone working on organizations that operate in the developing world, we find a really deeply insightful institutional ethnography, where well-intentioned attempts to pass the baton of development decisions to those who come from the national, regional context does not always immediately manifest into effective initiatives. To start to draw this to a close, I want to reference part of the final chapter of the book, where Martin revisits a scene recounted by Walter Benjamin, who found a French translation of Nietzsche's work whilst wandering along the banks of the Seine in Paris. When searching for some of his favourite passages in the translated work, he failed to recognise them, and even as it eventually transpired that they were staring him right in the face. In his book, Martin relates this vignette to the time he spent with ISOMOD and the other Himalayan partner NGOs, whose conservation and development ambitions were still only rarely predicated on sustained, deep engagements with the landscapes that they seek to cure. Although the outputs they produced were based on data taken from the region, Martin witnessed the Himalayan landscape being rendered into almost indecipherable knowledge products that represented almost nothing of the world he'd come to know in the time spent with these communities. Martin relays the frustration and almost anger at the fact that, in his view, the organisation had got it all wrong about Himalayan landscapes and livelihoods. Just like Benjamin's experience of the French translation, the same content was ostensibly there, but something of its essential spirit had been lost. And the haunted silences that come with revisiting a world in translation were screamingly evident. Now, I had the reverse experience when reading this book. I saw the world of Walang and ISOMOD transposed exactly onto the page, and was assailed by an almost transcendental feeling that he'd got it all right. Although this is in large part a testament to Martin's excellent writing and capacities as a storyteller, analyst, and ethnographer, it would also be wrong of me to shy away from acknowledging that my experience relating to the book tacitly ratifies yet another theoretical point he makes. As anthropologists trained in similar institutions, he and I both speak and aspire to the same curational language when we recount the ethnographic gaze. He painted a world that I recognise not just because I was there, but because I'm trained to see in the same way, which may well be eons apart from the Himalayan life worlds that we as ethnographers hope to put to page. And I guess this is another reminder to treat my own assessment of the work with a pinch of salt. But the stories he described in the book were intimately familiar. Whilst in Walang, I heard tales of the Himalayan Odyssey of undocumented migration into the United States, like the one that he recounts in the book's epilogue, in real time, delivered to us in the village through dribs and drabs as the flickering mobile network allowed. Also, the atmosphere of an ISOMOD workshop that I've been lucky enough to attend a few times in my own research and field work was almost uncannily re-evoked in Martin's prose. Martin does capture this development world so well and casts a critical eye on well-intentioned processes that, out of respect and deference for the truly wonderful people that are so often involved in these interventions, we rarely feel willing or able to criticise. And Martin also makes important points about China and Chinese participation, that development organisations, and sometimes also just Western commentary, is unwilling to acknowledge when they lament the failures of certain initiatives in this country. All this to say that the book means a lot to me. It was a godsend when writing up my PhD thesis. So all I can say to the audience is that I highly recommend it. And to Martin, thank you again for your insightful commentary on this region.
Thank you so much, Alice. Jeff, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Sienna, Kurt, and everybody at Dartmouth for organizing this. Thank you, Alice, for these wonderful comments. I concur. It is a great book. Martin, I congratulate you. It's a wonderful read. I've had the pleasure, since we had a really cold weather here in St. Louis, to light a fire at night, pull my chair over, and read by the fireside. So I really enjoy it. It's very accessible. At times I felt like you were tying me into knots, because the shifts in topics and everything, but so sometimes you have to kind of, pull back and say, okay, how do we assess this? How do we pull it all together? But in the end, you come out very satisfied that this is really insightful. One of my criteria when I read a book like this is, how does it help me think differently about my own field work and my own analysis? And in that way, you succeeded in a lot of different ways. So I really like the focus on remoteness. What is it? But also how that can be used strategically, because I do see that in Newbury, a way to attract tourism, which is a great revenue generator. And in tourism, in some ways, there's this kind of dichotomy: those who stay and those who leave. Those who leave are, the successful ones, and those who stay aren't. But some of the most successful people in Newbury are those who did stay and who are able to capitalize on these markets and who are doing, I guess you could arguably better than a lot of people who, like you described, crossing from Central America into the US, incurring huge debts and then struggling to get out of it. So the simple narrative of those who leave are the successful ones doesn't always hold. But remoteness comes into this as a strategic resource. I really like your focus on pathways and the way that roads kind of map onto those, and how you can, kind of look at this nexus of trade and transportation and how it's wrapped up in development and so forth. Really insightful. And also, again, this idea of places and knots, which is, I think we all can experience that. My places and knots are St. Louis, where I communicate regularly with people in Nepal via social media and Zoom. Kathmandu, where a lot of them now live, where I always spend time, and in Newbury, and in Sienna's case, she can add New York because she spends a lot of time there with her Mustangi collaborators. But instead of kind of commenting more on the book, which I think Alice did beautifully, do you mind if we do a little bit of Q&A? Is that okay? Because I have some interesting questions for you, which emerge. And, because I did notice, we always notice those things that are unaddressed. And I don't want to make things that are unaddressed as a critique, because the worst book review you get is where somebody says, why didn't he write about this? He should have done this. Well, you didn't for various reasons. One of them, you can't do everything. So again, don't read this as a critique. But I was, I work with female researchers from Newbury and from Zoom. My research team has both. Whereas you are very, I loved your section at the end on your relationships with your fellow researchers. It's really insightful, and you acknowledge that they're all male, and that maybe it wouldn't be appropriate to work with females. In my case, I have for a long time. And one thing that occurred to me is that place knots are often tied through something that is almost invariably ignored in the research, which is female marital migration. When I go through Newbury with Chungchuk, who works with me for many years, we always stay at her aunt's houses in different villages. Her kin network is dispersed throughout the area, and these knots are tied through women marrying out of their households and ending up in different places. So, could you have conceived of these place knots differently, at least in the very kind of smaller constrained areas, or even in the broader areas, by focusing more on women and female mobility?
Yes, so I mean, probably that would have been a very good idea to do. As I try to explain at the end of the book, it wasn't really given to me that I could do that. But and it's all I can do is be honest about it, and be open about with whom I was able to work in which way. But there is also not exactly the same category. What I was, of course, the metaphor of the knot is such a widely used metaphor, and especially when it comes to all forms of social networks or networking or meshworks or whatever you want to call them. What I was interested with this idea of places in knots was not so much kind of to describe the linkages between people or families, but rather between places. That was the idea behind it. And uh, yes, I mean, this would be a very welcome additional dimension if there is this thing of marital relations that actually tie places together, that would totally fit what I was trying to say. It might also be that it's actually an argument that doesn't fit this place knot idea, that it's going into a different direction, and that would be equally interesting. It's like all of these ideas, all of these three ideas, like the pathways, the places in knots, and this idea of curation at large as a form to think about interventions from the outside. It's ideas. It's like it's not trying to be all-embracing large theory. It's trying to be, yes, concepts in a way, or figures of thought that prove to be useful for me at one point to think through the material I had collected, but not necessarily larger. And I've seen, especially with the pathways idea, this has been used in so many different ways. I sort of regret calling it pathways because it's such an open term. It's been used in so many different ways now, that it obviously triggered something in people, and that's maybe good, but it's not something that ties things down or would say, look, this is a pathway or this is not a pathway. It's not a definition I'm concerned with. And the same thing is true with the other two concepts. So if it's useful to think about marital relations, wonderful. If not, equally interesting.
Well, it's useful in my case. That's why I brought it up because, it hadn't even occurred to me, and it's just so obvious in my case. These relationships between villages. So, place knots, but at a very more local scale. I'll just ask one more question in lieu of time. But so these places do become connected. They do become place knots. New York City, Walloon, Kathmandu, these other areas. How, when, and through what processes can you envision that place knots could potentially unravel, or do they unravel? And the reason I ask this is because Sienna and I have a paper that's under review right now about these different migration dynamics. We're comparing highland valleys with middle hills. You mentioned labor migration versus more permanent migration. And Sonam Lotio, who's one of our co-researchers from SUM, he notes that the first generation of migrants invest tremendously in their natal villages. They're really committed to it. But then he worries about the next generation. And it's too early to tell because that next generation's young. But, if that's the case, if it's a generational loss, then in order to keep those ties alive, you need to have a continual stream of people being born in Walloon and migrating to keep those ties alive. So, in terms of potentially unraveling, can you see scenarios where that could happen?
Yes. I mean, it's certainly been a big worry for most of the elderly people I met, both in Boulder and in New York and in Jackson Heights, that exactly this would happen. Yeah, yeah. I mean, my daughter not even cares about anymore. She's now fully engulfed in being part of this Tibetan refugee club, but not she's no longer really from this valley. I heard that a lot, yes.
Yeah.
And border closures completely render a village useless for its original purpose. Might really be that people just leave, and that I've seen so many. Yeah, I mean, it's not just a question of the Himalayas. Yeah, no, currently working in Albania, there's so many completely abandoned villages. It's a slightly different story, but still, I mean, these things can break or can disintegrate, and it's a big worry. And the question or the figure of thought of place knots is how to tie them, how to keep them tied, how to tie them not too strongly so that they don't strangle you. And Walloon and especially the three villages, or one of the villages, especially in the Limi Valley, they have completely different strategies to do this. In the case of this one village in Limi of Algae or Walze, it's rules and fines for absences and a strict a strict code of who is part of this and who is no longer part of this. And if you're a monk leading a meditation center in California, you can still be part of the village, but you have to pay a fine for your absences in the village meetings. And in Wallung, no such thing exists. I mean, people have moved out of Wallung, but new people moved into Wallung, into the empty houses, and they also moved out. And there are things like the Wallung Welfare Society, where you literally can buy yourself in. You can buy yourself in and become a Wallunga in that sense. So it's a much more open, maybe a much more capitalist way of thinking community that I see in Wallung as compared to Walensee. But the basic task of trying to keep this together, because it does have value, it is really still important for loans to start a business, but also, well, this probably is changing now very rapidly, but also if you finally make your way to the US and you sit somewhere at the southern border in a detention center, it's the people you call, it's the people who give you an address, it's the people who help you for the next step. And so there is a lot of value still in keeping these non-local communities as tight-knit communities.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I do see the same in Newbury. There are some communities where it's similar. People will maintain land even though they don't live there, just so they can be part of the community, and they're willing to pay cash in lieu of community obligations. So, whereas others are very lax. But I don't want to take up any more time. But thank you very much. And again, great book. What a great read. I really appreciated it. Made me think of my own research in ways I hadn't anticipated.
It's wonderful to hear.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I know we've sort of begun the back and forth, but Martin, in sort of reflecting on Alice's comments as well as on what you and Jeff were just talking about, do you have anything else that, before we sort of open it up more broadly to those who are in the conversation as participants, anything else that you'd like us to think about or that you would like to further reflect on?
I would much rather open the discussion.
Great. Well, to remind those who are in the Zoomiverse with us, please do use the Q&A space, as Kurt mentioned, to share your questions. And maybe while we are waiting for some things to begin to populate there, I might just pick up with a question, Martin, for you, kind of building off of some things that both Alice and Jeff said. One set of questions that I'm curious about in the work that Jeff and I are doing right now, but just generally in sitting with places in knots, is actually about these sort of dual economies that are functioning between the kind of community-based networks of capitalist flow that help people get to places like New York or help fund particular projects, and then what an institution like ISAMODE sees or doesn't see in terms of the economies of these places. So that's one question, just sort of to what extent do these different visions of what kind of economics even means overlap? Where are the blind spots as you saw them? And then a second question, which has some connection but also difference, is actually about return or about in-migration or internal migration to Nepal, sort of to a place like Wallung from somewhere else, right, to those abandoned homes. I'm curious to learn more about that, because that again is a dynamic that both Jeff and I are seeing in different ways in our current project and in the places in different parts of Nepal that we both know well.
Yes. The two different economies or two different imaginaries of what economy is. Maybe it's only one, but maybe the thing is that ISAMODE itself is something that has value, much more than what it does or what it produces. NGOs, especially kind of the ICIMOD is not really an NGO, it's actually a governmental organization of 8 different countries, but it functions very much as like an NGO, or its vibes are very much the NGO vibes. Yeah, it's in conversations with the entire NGO world in Nepal. And the thing is that these are, even if it's not the best paid jobs, but these have a very, it's tied to a lot of symbolic capital. If you score a job with an organization like ICIMOD, it's much more than the money. It brings you somewhere. It gets you a certain prestige in Nepal. So ICIMOD is part of the economy, actually, just not exactly in the way they think they are. It's really interesting when they talk about stakeholders. I was so naive. I thought stakeholders are the people concerned with all these projects, but that's not the case. If ICIMOD talks about stakeholders, it's the organizations from the 8 member states that have a stake in the projects, not the people the projects concern. So that's, yeah, for me a very interesting distinction. So maybe it's one economy. It's just its development is a big milk cow, and the skill to milk it is one that is very important to learn, not just in Nepal, but we learn how to get grants. It's a particular way of writing prose nobody ever wants to read, but you can get better at it, and it's a very strange thing. You have to learn how to milk that cow. And if you grow up in a place like Nepal, and if you want to do certain things, you'd better learn how to do that, how to milk these cows, and how to write for that, and how to learn the language. And it's not just English, it's a particular language that ties into all these discourses, that you have to familiarize yourself, and you have to be aware which topics are possible at the moment and which topics are used to be very important but can no longer be pushed at this particular conjuncture. So I mean, it's all of these things that are important to learn, and that's where ICIMOD is it's part of the same industry as a commodity part of this development industry, as long as it still exists. And let's hope it still exists in a few years.
Yes, we are intimately familiar with these kinds of questions and dynamics right now.
Yeah. It was really interesting. I mean, now it's the topic of the day, but even during the time when I was at ICIMOD, it was just after the European refugee crisis, like 2016. And there was no more money for things like climate change in the Himalayas or glacial lake over Glofs or things like that. The only money you would get was tied to refugees for a brief moment in time. And it hit ICIMOD quite severely. Like, glaciers were out, borders were in, but the European borders, yeah. And now you have to remind me of the second question, because I wanted to say something there.
Yes, the second question was about in-migration,
Yes.
dynamics of abandonment and return.
Yes. This is super interesting, because I thought this was quite unique to Wanung, but if it's not, it's really, really interesting. It's certainly not taking place in Humla or in Limi also. But it would, in Wanung, it's simply because it still serves kind of as or I don't know how that is now, to be honest. Alice, you would have to fill me in when the last family has actually really moved to Wanung. But it used to be the case that the families would move out, and then new families would move in from the surrounding peripheries. And it usually is the same thing. I mean, it's very closely tied to pastoralism, the role of pastoralism in Himalayan societies, or in actually not just Himalayan societies, in most settings. I mean, I've seen the same thing in Central Asia. I see the same thing in Albania now. It's pastoralism is a step towards developing a business, for example. It's a high-risk gamble with a huge return and a lot of work that you can do for a few years, for 10 years, for 15 years. And once you sell all the animals, then you can have actually the starting capital to start something else, like a guest house or a business. Or so it's very often going exactly that road. And moving to Walong is often done when people have done that pastoralism thing and sell their animals. And then they move to Walong to try their luck, for example, in business.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, many thoughts are percolating on that front. We do have a question that's been put in the Q&A, which is, thank you for this discussion. I was wondering if the metaphor of the place knot came to you in the field or when you were outside of your field site / getting ready to write.
It came to me in the field. It came to me in the field. I can't exactly remember when I first had the term as a term, but it was most definitely at a quite early stage in the field. Yeah.
Great. Since we're waiting for some more questions, I have another one,
Okay.
which is Martin. You know, you produce and reflect on knowledge in many different forms in your life work, right? As a photographer, as a filmmaker, and also as a writer and researcher. And so I'm wondering about how you thought about this project in relation to those other multimodal forms that you're familiar with, that you love, as a vehicle for sharing knowledge. And, you know, maybe if this book were a film, or if this book were to take place in some other format, what would that be like? What would that look like?
Yeah, I tried actually at the beginning. I thought that I would also work as a filmmaker, or I would also start working towards a documentary film on one or both of these places. And then I tried, I started, but it never really came together. And that is probably not so much because there is a conflict between being an anthropologist and a filmmaker, but much rather because filmmaking, as I understand it, is very much a collective thing. You to make yeah, to that is it requires at least a small team to be satisfactory. You need separate sound. You need more than a couple of eyes, or I at least have never been sort of that one man gang of yeah. I can't do that really. And the other thing is that I was really doing a lot of photography at that time. I had this blog, The Other Image, which was crucial for all of this. Actually, all of the ideas in this book developed from these little stories on The Other Image. It's still up. It's theotherimage.com. It's like it was my exercise in integrating my photography work more into my everyday life, be it on field work or not on field work, and just to use images or the process of making images and writing about them as a yeah, just as a practice of reflection. And this book and more or less everything I wrote during this time came from working as a photographer. And as all of you who work in film and photography will know, there is nothing that bites itself more than being a filmmaker or being a photographer. You can't be both. It's a just such a different way of visually approaching the field. So I was the photographer on this and not the filmmaker.
But okay, if I ask another question?
Absolutely, Jeff. Go ahead.
So, as I was reading through this, I was struck, you know, places and knots. You're talking about places that connect together. I could an argument be made that institutions can also be nodes in a knot? Because I'm thinking specifically about monasteries that have relocated from Tibet to Nepal or India And it doesn't really matter where they are, it matters what they are and how places are connected with it. Like, you know, from a trickle to a torrent, we documented that the monastic migration was not random. Kids weren't being sent to any monastery. They were sent to specific monasteries that had historical connections with Newbury. So, you know, what's the role of institutions as nodes in a place knot?
I feel that you know much more about this than I do, honestly. Um, yeah, it seems to me that a similar figure of thought could actually be very helpful when it comes to Tibetan monasteries and the relocation of Tibetan monasteries and the ties and conflicts and competition between them and their followers, yeah, and their following and stuff. And this has really become this sort of a this sort of transnational arrangement. I remember it was really interesting when my second visit to Walong was during an annual monastery festival, Futuk. It's also described in the book, and at that time I had this research team working on all different places around the globe, but in the Highlands of Asia actually at that time, and many of them came to that monastery festival, and there was a Chinese woman working with somebody else in the team on a different topic in China, and she started started chatting with the head lama that was hired to lead the ceremony there. Why? Because the head lama had a huge Chinese followership and actually had a monastery in Taiwan, and and then in like there is a monastery closely linked to the yeah to the Rinpoche tied to the Limi Valley and in Kathmandu, and there it was very much the same thing. You realized that these ties wouldn't stop there, that they would actually really reach into very much into the international branches of this monastery in China, in the US, in France. So yeah, maybe it's a very good way to think about these networks of monasteries, to think about, yeah, these kind of monasteries in a knot thing. Yeah.
Well, I think it definitely is, because when I was reading through, you know, again, this is a tribute to your thoughts and analysis. It made me think differently about it, and that's why I thought about institutions as, you know, not set places, but certainly nodes in these place knots. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially monasteries in the Tibetan world. I mean, they always they always functioned as nodes in a wider network. So the metaphor certainly resonates with this.
Alice, I'm wondering if in listening to the conversation as it has unfolded and your lovely comments earlier on, if you have any other questions or thoughts that are percolating for Martin or the collective.
And maybe just to sort of briefly address, you know, the broader question of immigration to Walloon, just from a slightly more like updated perspective. So I was in Walloon from November 2021 to May 2022. So it was a really, the word was obviously overused, but unprecedented time in the village's history as well as global history. And very much the question was being raised by people at the time whether if the Chinese border remained closed, people would continue to live there. So it was very much an active and ongoing debate. I heard the prediction from the Walloon chairman that if the border remained closed for 5 years, he said 50% of people will leave due to lack of income, which obviously raises even more acute questions about the livelihoods of the 50% who stay, since, you know, the resilience of a shrinking village economically also shrinks when the village shrinks. now I haven't been back since I finished my fieldwork in 2022, so a lot of these questions are still ongoing. I was living in Kathmandu for about a year after I finished my fieldwork, and I did start to see a couple of families trickling into Boulder, as I had kind of expected. So the question of fresh in-migration into Walong, my prediction or expectation would be that maybe that stopped. But the whole wider Taplajung area of Upper Taplajung is subject to sort of similar border dynamic, even if Walong is the central node of that trade route. So you might find that sort of the outside villages, as Martin sort of does describe in the book, people from the outside villages might start to move in if the prospects in these further, more peripheral villages becomes even worse. But it's really hard to call, which is why hopefully when I go back in just over a month, hopefully we'll start to get more up-to-date answers about those questions. But yeah, it's a tricky one.
Thanks. Yeah, this is something that Jeff and I are thinking about right now quite a bit, related to the question of the care for those who remain behind, especially if they are of an older generation. What counts as old is, an interesting question in and of itself, and that's one that we're actually also exploring. But yeah, what sorts of perhaps new knots, new ties of connection are being formed by virtue of either sort of broader community socioeconomic need, or by the need and the dynamics of particular families or extended families related to those who remain. Jeff and I are also trying to think about, Martin, I'm thinking about the centrality of place to how you conceive of this idea of not. And one of the questions that we are exploring in this project on aging has to do with, there's this sort of notion of aging in place, right? The idea that this is something people aspire to not move, right? And yet part of what migration can produce is this idea that place moves with people, right? So aging in place, aging in Mustang now is possible in the physical place of New York City, even though the actual place still remains somewhere else. So again, this is just sort of me thinking through your core metaphor as it relates to what Jeff and I are working on, but also this idea of who remains, and what their realities are like, how they feel tied.
And I may add to that with the population churn being people moving out and people moving in, you can maintain your population size, but you've got a very different composition of your population. And we see that there were great studies of the Swiss Alps showing that some of those towns that are ski resorts now, the population is still very large, but it's completely different people and family names than who were there 100 years ago, for example. And so we've been analyzing the census data from Nepal to find that places like Manang, their population declined, but then it rebounded, and it was because people moving from elsewhere. Lower Mustang, similar thing. I think there's a question in the Q&A, so I'll quiet down now.
Yes, we have a question from Annalise Brown, who's asking, you explore the effects of tourism in the Himalayas. In your view, does tourism create opportunities for local communities, or does it lead to further entrenchment of remoteness in unexpected ways?
Tourism certainly creates opportunities for local communities, and not just local communities. It creates an abundance of opportunities. The problem is that it's usually it's the standard answer that development has for any sort of, if you're remote and living in a beautiful landscape, that's kind of how you see this place, then sustainable ecotourism is the way to go, regardless of setting, regardless of anything. It's the same thing all around the world. Problem is, it's not a very solid thing, Come a crisis, it's gone. In Nepal, I've seen this now several times happening, yeah, that tourism just completely evaporated for a few years. And actually, it's almost as if people would go from crisis to crisis in this tourism business. And what you have is you have investment going into small lodges, training, and it's quite substantial investments actually that go into in these valleys. But it's sometimes difficult to, if you do an investment and then nobody comes for 3 years because there is a financial crisis or a war or a pandemic, it's very difficult to justify these things. So tourism alone is not a very sound strategy, I find. But somehow the development world hasn't come up with a different answer on what to tell people should do. Yeah. Yes. And there was a second part. Does it lead to further entrenchment of remoteness? Yeah, I mean, remoteness, the way I see it, is really something that is an ascription from the outside, and it is a resource. So it's in tourism, remoteness is a resource because untouched and remote is equals authentic, and that's what attracts people. But remoteness is also a resource because it shields you from too much attention by the state, for example. Remoteness can also be a resource in that way that you can do things you can't do elsewhere. It protects you uh, from certain things that you don't want the state to know or to do with you. Legality is often a question that comes with remoteness, and sometimes it's not even outright illegality that is the topic, but just the absence of institutions that would make things legal that have an influence. It's very much one of the reasons why these remote border crossings between Nepal and Tibet saw this boom. Because especially in the herb business, when China started seeing that so much was imported, China started implementing proper checks and plant quarantine, and it led to an abundance of problems because the Tibetan names wouldn't fit the biological Latin names, and it was just a mess. And you did the perfectly good herbs couldn't be imported because the Chinese names and the Latin names and the Tibetan names didn't correspond, and it was just a huge mess. And to get around all of this and to get uh, away from the scrutiny of the state, these remote border crossings were wonderful because nobody would really look too closely. Changed in 2015, 16, 17. But for a while, this was exactly what you wanted. So remoteness is a resource that is used in different ways. It's also a curse, but it's also a resource.
Thanks so much for those questions. I know we're getting close to the end of time. And so in these last few minutes, I'd like to invite either Martin or Jeff or Alice, if you have any kind of last thoughts or comments, things you'd like to sort of leave us with, questions, perhaps, Martin, that you continue. You know, we put a book out into the world, and then you think that, and then of course, you know, a new life starts. The book has its own life. The ideas continue to work in and on you. And so I'm wondering now, you know, a bit out from the publication of this book, but it's still somewhat new and somewhat, you know, your mind is probably also moving on. Where is this book sitting right now in your own thinking?
I still like it. I can still stand behind it, but it's also very much part of a certain time or a certain era that, and I think that it really remains to be seen if these suggested ideas or figures of thought or mid-level concepts really have currency in the long run. I am not sure. Places in knots might be something that was, but no longer is. Pathways may be something that are, maybe they are paved over, tunneled, trained with trains. Maybe, yeah, maybe this entire notion of trying to bring together sort of the top-down thin simplifications that you still see in international development with the true ambition to care and cure will tip, and it suddenly will be only top-down intervention again. There are signs that point into this direction. So I'm not sure if these ideas really will stand the test of time, but I think they do something, and they explain some things in Nepal for a certain time, and they might actually be useful in other places. By useful, I don't mean, it's always much more interesting if you read a concept or read something and you apply it to your own situation and you realize it's not true. That's much more interesting than finding things that actually are exactly the same. I mean, finding these differences is much more productive than saying, yes, I mean, as this guy has said in this place, this must be true. I was reading one of the most formative experiences. You probably see that, but there is a lot of I clearly read some books when I was writing this book, and almost too much, I think now. But I only saw that after when I read it again. Actually, I didn't really notice when I was writing it so much. But one of the most formative reads, actually on a phone in the tent, was Anna Tsing's Friction. That came out, like, I think in 2005 or so, and I read it maybe in, I don't know, 2010 or 11. It wasn't on my radar for a while, but then it was, and then I read this book, and it was so interesting because she's writing about the forest and all these companies moving into Kalimantan. It's Indonesia, it's a completely different setting, and she writes about these roads that lead to nowhere, these forests, these logging roads that lead to nowhere, and like all that world that emerged to the sides of these roads, and how that, and it resonated so much. My tent was literally like 20 meters from one of these pathways that started booming again. And I thought, yeah, well, but the main difference is that these roads lead somewhere. My roads lead somewhere, and they've always led somewhere. That is the big difference to the logging roads. And that's why this entire idea of friction had so much currency for me. Not because I would say it's like Anna Tsing said in friction, but it produced productive friction with what I saw, And that was exactly that. Sometimes I hope that maybe this can happen with these sort of mid-level concepts. You use them and you throw them away, or you might even get angry at them because they're so untrue in your setting, And then it's productive.
I'm going to propose to Sienna that we incorporate the notion of place knots in our own research and see how it works. We're open-minded.
Yes.
If it doesn't work, we'll let you know.
Exactly.
If it
That
does,
is
it'll be
exactly
great.
what I was. Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, and on the note about sort of what we read as in relation to what we write, and the productive friction that can produce, I'll invite folks to thank our participants. I see little hands coming up through the Zoomiverse saying yay, yay, yay. So I will say yay, yay, yay. Yes, thank you so much, Martin, Jeff, Alice, for being part of this conversation today. Martin, thank you for sharing your work, and Kurt and everybody in South Asian Studies here at Dartmouth, thanks so much for organizing this event and this series.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Bye.